Chapter 1. The Shop That Doesn't Open. The village of Little Hadfeld announced itself, as so many English villages do, not with grandeur, but with a kind of gentle insistence. A bend in the lane, a scattering of rooftops the colour of weak tea, and the sudden unmistakable scent of wood smoke and wet hedgerow that told the traveller she had arrived somewhere that had not hurried to greet a new century. Miss Jane Marple, alighting from the London train with a small case and a smaller degree of urgency, thought it looked precisely like the sort of place where nothing at all could happen, which was, of course, exactly the sort of place where she had learned, over a long and observant life, that everything eventually did. Her niece Diana met her at the station with the particular brightness of a young woman glad of company, and slightly nervous of her aunt's reputation for noticing things. "You'll adore the tea-room," Diana said, as they walked the lane beneath a sky the colour of an old pearl button. "Everyone does. Miss Pruitt makes a lemon seed cake that's practically a local scandal. It's so good." She laughed, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Though you mustn't try to visit on a Sunday. It's the one day she never opens, never has, as long as I've lived here." Miss Marple, who collected small oddities of village behaviour the way other women collected china, filed this away with quiet interest, and said nothing more of it, for the moment. The copper kettle sat at the crooked heart of the high street, its bow window fogged faintly with the breath of teapots, its sign, a hand-painted kettle, its copper long faded to a dusty rose gold, swinging with a small patient creak in the afternoon wind. Inside, it was all one hoped for: low beams, the smell of butter and Darjeeling, a fire murmuring in the old stone hearth, though the day was mild, and presiding over it, with the unhurried grace of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of making strangers feel expected, was Eleanor Pruitt. She was a handsome woman still, silver-haired, upright, with the sort of face that had settled comfortably into kindness, the way some faces settle into disappointment. She poured their tea herself, asked after Diana's garden, complimented Miss Marple's brooch with real attention rather than idle politeness. And yet Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching hands rather than faces, for it was the hands that told the truer story, noticed that Eleanor's own trembled very slightly as she set down the pot. Not the tremor of age, the tremor of a woman listening, always, for something behind her. "You've a lovely little tradition here," Miss Marple said, in the mild, encouraging tone she used when she wished to be told rather more than she had asked. "Closing on Sundays, so rare these days for a shop to keep such a personal custom." Something crossed Eleanor Pruitt's face then, swift and gone almost before it arrived, like a bird's shadow over a lawn. "An old habit," she said, and her voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly final. "One grows attached to one's habits, Miss Marple. I find they keep a person steady." Her eyes, for just a moment, went to the door at the back of the shop, the stockroom door, painted the same soft green as the walls, entirely unremarkable, and then away again, quickly, as though she had caught herself looking at something she had promised long ago not to look at. Miss Marple asked nothing further. She had learned that the most important doors in a conversation were the ones people shut too quickly, and that patience, not persistence, was generally what pried them open again. The afternoon wore on gently. There was talk of the church fete, of Diana's roses, of the vicar's unfortunate sermon on charity that had run to 55 minutes. Eleanor laughed at the right moments, refilled the pot without being asked, and seemed, on the whole, entirely herself. And yet Miss Marple carried away from that tea-table an impression she could not quite name, of a woman standing very correctly at the edge of something, the way one stands at the edge of a well one has looked into too many times to be curious about it any longer, only afraid. She thought of it again that night, in the unfamiliar quiet of Diana's spare room, the village settling around her into the particular hush of the deep country dark, no motor cars, only owls, and once, far off, the soft complaint of a gate. She was nearly asleep when she heard it, the frantic, tinny ring of a bicycle bell, cutting through the lane like something that had no business being in such a peaceful place. Moments later came the knock, urgent, unpracticed, the knock of a man unused to delivering bad news and finding no gentle way to arrange the words. Diana's candle wavered in the hall. The door opened, and there stood young Constable Hedges, cap in hand, his face the colour of the pearl-buttoned sky, his voice unsteady with something between shock and a kind of bewildered dread. "Miss Marple, forgive the hour. It's Miss Pruitt, at the tea-room. She's been found dead in the stockroom." He swallowed, and his eyes, when they met hers, held the particular horror of a fact that made no sense at all. "It's Sunday morning, miss. The shops never opened on a Sunday, and the door was bolted from the inside." Chapter 2. The Bolted Room. The lane to the tea-room, so cheerful in the afternoon light, wore a different face entirely in that grey hour before a Sunday sunrise. Mist lay along the cobbles like something that had not yet decided to leave, and the few villagers already gathered outside the copper kettle stood in the particular huddled silence of people who sense, without being told, that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the shape of their world. Miss Marple, wrapped in her good grey coat, walked beside Constable Hedges with the unhurried step of a woman who understood that arriving quickly at a tragedy rarely helped it, while arriving thoughtfully sometimes did. The shop's bow window, so often fogged with the friendly breath of teapots, was dark and strangely blind-looking. Someone, Hedges most likely, in his first act of authority, had drawn the curtain across it, as though the little tea-room itself required modesty in its grief. Inspector Corbett met them at the door. He was a heavy-set man with the slow, careful manner of a policeman more accustomed to poached salmon and boundary disputes than to anything resembling this, and he greeted Miss Marple with the particular wariness of a professional who has heard, through some chain of village gossip, that this small elderly woman possesses a reputation rather larger than her frame. "I'm told you knew her," he said, by way of both greeting and question. "I had tea with her yesterday afternoon," Miss Marple said gently. "Which is not at all the same as knowing her, Inspector, though it is sometimes the beginning of it." He led her through the shop, the familiar tables now pushed slightly askew, as though the constable had blundered through them in his haste, to the stockroom door at the back. It stood open now, propped by a rolled cloth, though the manner in which it had been forced open was evident in the splintering along the frame where Hedges, presumably, had put his shoulder to it in the small hours. "Bolted from the inside," Corbett said, gesturing to the heavy iron bolt now hanging loose and bent from its housing. "Sound one, too. No trickery to it. Not a spring bolt. Not one of those clever London contraptions you read about. A plain, honest bolt, the sort a person throws with their own hand and cannot throw from the other side of the door." Miss Marple did not go immediately to the body, though it lay there, beneath a sheet someone had thoughtfully provided, upon the flagstones between shelves of tinned goods and dried lavender bundles, awaiting some future potpourri. She went first to the door itself, And there she stood for a long moment, saying nothing, while Corbett shifted his weight, and Hedges, behind them, kept his eyes fixed studiously upon the middle distance, the way young men do, when they wish very much not to look at what they have already looked at once. The bolt was old, she could see that from the pitting of the iron, the decades of paint layered thinly over its surface, a green so faded it had become the colour of a duck's egg left too long in the sun. And yet when she leaned closer than perhaps Inspector Corbett found entirely proper in a woman of her years, she caught, beneath the mustiness of the stockroom, a faint, unmistakable note. Oil. Fresh oil, the sort one uses on a hinge or a lock that has grown stiff, the sort no one troubles to apply to a bolt that has sat untouched and unremarkable for 30 years. "Inspector," she said mildly, "when was this bolt last oiled, do you suppose?" Corbett blinked. "Can't say it signifies, Miss Marple. A shopkeeper keeps her fixtures in order." "Women are tidy that way." "They are indeed," Miss Marple agreed, in the tone of a woman conceding a small point in order to hold firmly to a larger one, "though I find that the fixtures we keep most carefully oiled are generally the ones we use most often. And this, I am given to understand, is a door that is never used at all." She did not press the matter further. She had learned, across a great many years and a great many drawing-rooms, that a policeman allowed to discover a thing for himself 3 days after a lady first mentioned it would defend that discovery with considerably more vigour than one handed it outright. She turned, then, to the body, approaching it not with the brisk clinical interest of the young police surgeon crouched beside it, nor with the queasy avoidance of poor Hedges, but with something closer to a quiet, formal respect, as one might approach an open coffin at a funeral where one had not been terribly close to the deceased, but felt her loss all the same. Eleanor Pruitt lay on her side, her silver hair loosened from its customary pins and fallen across her face, one hand still curled. Miss Marple noted this with particular care, not in the outflung gesture of a fall, but closed gently, almost deliberately, as though she had been holding something small when she died, and had not wished to let it go even in dying. There was no wound visible, no violence to the scene beyond a tin of tea leaves overturned nearby, its contents scattered across the flagstones in a small dark fan, like spilled ink. "Her heart, the doctor thinks," Corbett offered, following her gaze. "No mark on her. Dr. Combs examining her proper this afternoon, but he says it has the look of a woman who simply went, sat down among her tins of tea, and went." "And yet she bolted the door first," Miss Marple murmured, "and came, on the one day she never comes." Corbett had no answer for that, and to his credit, did not pretend to one. It was as the surgeon's men were preparing to move the body that Miss Marple's attention was drawn, quite by accident, to the small writing desk tucked into the corner of the stockroom, an old, unassuming piece of furniture, its surface cluttered with invoices and a ledger bound in cracked green leather, the sort of ledger a careful shopkeeper keeps to record her orders and her accounts. She had no particular reason to look at it. She looked at it anyway, for Miss Marple had long ago concluded that the desks people keep in the rooms they believe no one else will enter are often more honest than the rooms they keep for company. She opened the ledger with 2 careful fingers, turning past columns of tidy figures. Tea, sugar, the butcher's account, all the small, unremarkable arithmetic of a life spent making other people comfortable, until her eye caught upon something that stopped her quite still. A page had been torn away. Not lost, not worn, torn, the ragged edge still fresh and pale against the browned age of the surrounding pages, as though it had been removed not decades ago with the rest of the book's history, but recently, very recently indeed. She turned back to the preceding page and found, in Eleanor's careful sloping hand, the tail end of an entry dated some 30 years past, a date that meant nothing to her yet, save that it sat directly beside the wound of the missing page, like a scar beside a fresh cut. "Inspector," she said, and something in her voice, quiet still, but changed, brought Corbett to her side at once. "I wonder if you would be so good as to have someone discover for me what became of this." Corbett peered at the torn edge, frowning. "Old ledger. Women tear pages for shopping lists, Miss Marple, for notes to the milkman." "They do," she agreed. "But not, I think, pages so carefully dated 30 years in the past, in a book a woman has otherwise kept with such loving precision for the whole of her working life." She closed the ledger gently, as one closes a book one intends to return to. "Miss Pruitt struck me, yesterday, as a woman who kept things very carefully indeed, Inspector. Her accounts, her habits, her Sundays. I begin to wonder whether she has spent 30 years keeping something else entirely, and whether someone, quite recently, discovered that she meant, at last, to stop." She looked once more toward the freshly oiled bolt, hanging bent and useless from the door frame, and toward the tea leaves, scattered like spilled ink across the flagstones, and toward the small, closed hand of the woman who had poured her tea so warmly, and so sadly, not 24 hours before. "Someone has been practicing with that door, my dear," she murmured to Diana, who had followed at a respectful distance and now stood pale in the stockroom's dim light. "Practicing quite recently, and I think, before this is finished, we shall find that Miss Pruitt did not die of her Sundays at all, but very much because of one." Chapter 3. 30 Years of Sundays. By Monday, the village had arranged itself into that peculiar hush particular to places where tragedy has visited, but has not yet been given a name to wear. The greengrocer's queue moved more slowly than usual, each customer lingering a moment longer than trade required, as though the exchange of a pound of apples might also yield some fragment of understanding. Miss Marple, walking the high street with Diana on the pretext of purchasing wool for a jumper she had no urgent need of, found this slowness entirely useful. For grief, she had long observed, loosens tongues that caution usually keeps buttoned. It was old Mrs. Latimer, seated in her habitual chair before the draper's window with her knitting untouched in her lap, who provided the first true thread. She was well past 80, sharp-eyed, despite failing hearing, and possessed of the particular fearlessness of the very old, who have buried enough of their contemporaries to no longer trouble themselves with tact. 30 years, near enough, since the kettle first closed of a Sunday, she said, when Miss Marple had settled beside her with the practised patience of a woman prepared to wait out a slow beginning. "I remember it well, because it was the same year my Arthur took the prize marrow at the fete, and he never did manage it again, poor love." She said this with no apparent awareness of how strange a marker it was for grief, and continued, "Eleanor shut up shop the Sunday after her sister went off, and never opened it again on the Lord's Day since. We none of us thought much of it at first. Grief does odd things to a person's habits. Her sister," Miss Marple said gently, as one lays down a single card and waits to see what follows. "Alice." Mrs. Latimer's needles, which had been still, now moved once, twice, as though the name itself required some occupation for the hands. younger than Eleanor by 6 years and wilder for it. Pretty girl, too pretty for her own good, my mother used to say, though I never held with that sort of talk myself, as if prettiness were a fault a girl ought to answer for. She sniffed. Ran off with a married man, so it was said. London, someone thought, though no one ever had it from her own hand. No letter home, not one, in 30 years. Broke Eleanor's heart entirely, though she never spoke of it above a whisper, and never once after that Sunday. And the shop closed that same week, Miss Marple mused, and has remained closed every Sunday since. As I say, Mrs. Latimer's needles stilled again. We stopped asking, in time. You do, don't you, when a thing's gone on long enough? It becomes simply how things are, and you forget there was ever a day it became so. Miss Marple thanked her, and moved on with Diana toward the churchyard, where the Reverend Whitfield could generally be found of a Monday morning, tending to the small correspondences of a parish, christenings to arrange, a leaking vestry roof to lament, that constituted the quieter business of his calling. He was a thin, stooped man, of perhaps 60, with the gentle, slightly apologetic manner of a clergyman who had spent a lifetime comforting others, and had never quite learned to ask for comfort himself, and he greeted them with evident relief at the interruption to his ledgers. "A dreadful business," he said, when the subject of Eleanor arose, and Miss Marple noted that his hands, folding and unfolding a scrap of paper upon his desk, betrayed a disquiet rather greater than the occasion of a parishioner's death, however sudden, generally produced in a man so long accustomed to the rituals of mortality. She was a good woman, a generous one. Only last month she gave the full proceeds of the harvest tea toward the roof fund, when she'd every right to keep it for her own custom. She seemed troubled when I met her, Miss Marple said. I wondered whether something recent weighed upon her, beyond the ordinary sorrows of a woman getting on in years. The Reverend's hands stilled upon the scrap of paper. "She came to me," he said, after a pause long enough to be its own kind of confession, "some weeks back. Asked about—" He stopped, and began again more carefully. "She asked what might be required, in the Church's understanding, to open an old grave, to confirm who lay within it, and to have a proper stone set, where none had stood before." Miss Marple's needles, for she had of course brought her own knitting, and found the small domestic motion an excellent accompaniment to listening, went very still. "An unmarked grave, Reverend, near the yew, at the northern wall." He would not meet her eyes now, his gaze fixed instead upon the leaded window and the grey churchyard beyond it. "It has stood so a great many years. I told her," he swallowed, "I told her such matters required time and consideration, and that these things are not undertaken lightly. She said she understood. She said she had waited 30 years already, and that a little longer would not signify, so long as it was done before." He stopped himself, visibly, as a man stops himself at the very edge of a confidence he has not yet decided he is permitted to give. "Before what, Reverend Whitfield?" "She did not finish the sentence," he said, and Miss Marple, watching the small tremor at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes returned again and again to that leaded window, as though the grave itself might be visible through it, thought that this was very probably true, and very probably also not the whole of what he knew. They walked out together into the churchyard, the Reverend excusing himself to the vestry with the haste of a man glad to end a conversation, and Miss Marple made her way, without any great appearance of purpose, toward the northern wall, where the yew's dark boughs cast a permanent, patient shade over a scattering of older stones, some so worn by weather their inscriptions had faded to mere suggestion, like breath upon a mirror. The grave, when she found it, required no great skill to identify, for it stood apart from its neighbours in the particular loneliness of a stone that bears no name. A small rectangle of grass, slightly sunken with age. No cross, no lettering, no date. Only a low, unmarked curb of stone, gone green with lichen, tended, she noticed with a small and specific chill, rather more carefully than a forgotten grave ought to be. The grass was trimmed close. Someone came here, and had come for a very long time, and had done so with the quiet devotion of a person visiting not a stranger, but someone dearly, unbearably loved. She stood before it a long while, the wind moving softly through the yew above her, and thought of Eleanor Pruitt's trembling hands upon the teapot, and her eyes sliding, quick and guilty, toward the stockroom door. She thought of a shop closed every Sunday for 30 years, and a ledger page torn out and dated to a summer 3 decades gone, and a sister who had vanished to London and never once written home. "Diana," she said quietly, and her niece came to stand beside her, following her aunt's gaze down to the small green mound of unmarked earth. "I wonder whether we have been asking the wrong question entirely. We have been asking who might have wished Eleanor Pruitt dead. I begin to think we ought to have been asking, from the very first, who is buried here, and whether the woman who tended this grave so faithfully for 30 years was not mourning her sister's absence at all, but keeping watch, instead, over her sister's grave." She looked once more at the bare, nameless stone, and something in her expression, that mild, unhurried face capable of such sudden and terrible clarity, made even Diana, who did not yet understand the whole of what her aunt suspected, feel the cold pass entirely through her. "Whom do we bury, my dear?" Miss Marple murmured, half to herself, half to the silent yew above them, "when we tell ourselves, for 30 years, that we are burying no one at all." Chapter 4. The Girl Who Never Wrote Home. The post office in Little Hadfeld was a narrow, low-ceilinged establishment that had changed hands only twice in living memory, and its present custodian, Mr. Aldous Fenn, possessed the particular gift of village postmasters everywhere, an encyclopedic memory for who corresponded with whom, tempered by just enough professional discretion to make the extraction of it feel less like gossip and more like a kindness reluctantly granted. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that a post office was very often a village's true confessional, called upon him the following morning with a small parcel she did not urgently need to send, and a great many questions she did. "Alice Pruitt," Mr. Fenn repeated, when the name was gently introduced, and something in his weathered face softened into the particular tenderness men reserve for a girl remembered fondly from their own youth. "Now there's a name I've not heard spoken above a whisper in 30 years. Lovely creature," laughed like she meant it, if you understand me. Not the way some girls laugh. All show and no feeling behind it. "You knew her well. Well enough. She'd come in most weeks, waiting on a letter." He paused, and Miss Marple, watching the small furrow that gathered between his brows, understood that they had arrived, without any great effort on her part, at the heart of the matter. That's the odd thing of it, if you want my honest opinion, which nobody's troubled to ask in 30 years. She was expecting a letter that summer. I couldn't say from whom, though I'd my suspicions, and then, of a sudden, she stopped coming in at all, and after she'd gone off, as they said, to London, well, there was never a letter from her either, not one, in 30 years. A girl runs off with a man, she generally can't help but write her people eventually, if only to crow a little, or beg forgiveness, or ask for money. Alice never did either. Did that not strike you as strange at the time? It struck a good many of us as strange, Mr. Fenn admitted, lowering his voice as though the shop's dim corners might yet be listening. But Eleanor put it about very firmly that Alice wished no contact, that she was ashamed of the whole business and preferred to be let alone. And Eleanor was not a woman one contradicted easily, even in kindness. She discouraged all inquiry, Miss Marple, quite firmly. There was talk, early on, of writing to the London police. Constable Redditch's father was constable then, and I recall he wished to make some inquiry of the railway, at the very least, to confirm she'd travelled. And Eleanor asked him not to, begged him, near enough, said it would only humiliate Alice further if she were found and dragged home against her wishes. He shook his head slowly. We none of us liked to press a grieving sister on the matter. It seemed unkind. I wonder now whether it was not unkindness we were sparing her, but something else entirely. Miss Marple thanked him with the particular warmth she reserved for those who had, without quite intending it, handed her something of genuine value, and made her way from the post office toward the small cluster of cottages that had once, Mrs. Latimer had mentioned in passing, housed the Pruitt sisters together, before Eleanor took the rooms above the tea-room alone. It was Diana who suggested, over their modest luncheon, that the old Pruitt cottage, long since let to a retired schoolmistress, a Miss Pargeter, who had occupied it these past 20 years, might still hold some remnant of that distant summer in its loft or outbuildings, the way old houses so often retain, unasked, the sediment of lives long since moved on. Miss Pargeter, a brisk, kindly woman, entirely unconnected to the tragedy save through the accident of her address, was only too pleased to permit a look, and led them up a narrow ladder into a loft thick with the dust of decades, lit only by a single grimed window through which the grey Sunday-coloured light fell in a long, dim column. It was there, among broken chair legs and a moth-eaten christening gown belonging to some Pargeter grandchild, that Miss Marple found it, pushed far back beneath the eaves, where the roof sloped too low for a grown person to easily reach, a small travelling trunk of the sort a young woman might have carried to London 30 years before, its leather cracked and pale with age, its brass clasps furred green with disuse. She knelt before it with rather more effort than she cared to admit, and worked the clasps loose with careful fingers. Inside, folded with the particular neatness of a packing done in haste but with love, the neatness, she thought, of someone else's hands, not the owner's own, lay a summer dress of faded blue cotton, a pair of good shoes scarcely worn, a small collection of letters tied with ribbon, and, tucked beneath them all, a single train ticket, 3rd class, London via Reading, dated for a Sunday 30 years past, unused. Miss Marple sat back upon her heels in the dim, dusty light of that loft, the unused ticket held lightly between her fingers, and felt the whole shape of the mystery shift beneath her, quietly and completely, the way a familiar room seems suddenly foreign the moment one notices a single piece of furniture has been moved. She never went to London at all, she said softly, and Diana, crouched beside her, went very still. A girl does not pack her good shoes and her letters, and leave her ticket unused in a trunk hidden beneath the eaves of her own home, and still contrive to travel 30 miles by rail. This trunk was packed, my dear, by someone who wished it to look as though Alice had left, and then it was hidden, and forgotten by someone who never had occasion or never had the heart to remove the evidence of the lie. She untied the ribbon from the small bundle of letters with careful fingers and found them to be nothing more than old correspondence from a school friend, some sisterly note or two, nothing that spoke directly to the tragedy. And yet, tucked among them, a folded scrap of paper, unsigned, in a hand quite different from Alice's own rounded, girlish script. Only a few words, the ink faded but legible still in the grey light. You must not tell E. It will end everything I have built. Meet me Sunday, as before, and we will settle it quietly between us. Miss Marple read it twice, and then a third time, and felt the particular cold certainty settle over her that she had felt only a handful of times in a long life devoted to the small and terrible truths of ordinary places. "Diana," she said, very quietly, folding the note back along its old creases, with the reverence one gives to something that has waited 30 years to be found. "I think we have just discovered why Alice Pruitt never wrote home from London. I think, my dear, she never left this village at all, and I think someone here has known it, and carried it, every single day since." Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Kindness. Mr. Victor Hale's offices occupied the handsomest building on the High Street after the bank, a narrow Georgian frontage of soft grey stone, its brass plate polished to a discreet gleam, its window dressed with nothing so vulgar as advertisement, only a single dish of ferns arranged with the sort of understated taste that spoke, quietly but unmistakably, of a man who had spent a great many years learning precisely how respectability ought to look. He had handled the affairs of little Hadfeld's better families for the better part of 3 decades, and it was, therefore, entirely unremarkable that he should be the one entrusted with the modest business of Eleanor Pruitt's estate, and entirely natural that Miss Marple, in the ordinary course of an old friend's bereavement, should be received by him with warmth. He rose from behind his desk as they entered, a tall, well-preserved man of perhaps 55, silver at the temples in a manner that suggested distinction rather than age, his handshake firm, his voice pitched to that particular register of sympathy solicitors cultivate for the bereaved, sincere enough to comfort, controlled enough never to overstep. "A dreadful loss," he said, drawing out chairs for them both with an old-fashioned courtesy that Miss Marple noted, and filed away, as the sort of gesture performed so long it had become entirely unconscious, which was to say, precisely the sort of gesture that reveals a man most truly, for it required no thought to produce. Eleanor was a woman of remarkable constancy. One does not find her like easily in these hurried times. "You knew her a great many years, I understand," Miss Marple said, settling her hands upon her lap in the manner of a woman entirely at leisure, though her eyes moved, with their usual unhurried thoroughness, about the room, the framed certificates, the dark oil portrait of some Hale ancestor above the mantel, the small silver-framed photograph upon the desk of a handsome, well-dressed woman Miss Marple took to be the late Mrs. Hale. "Since I first came to the village," he said, 30 years, very nearly. I was a young man then, new to my profession, and little Hadfeld took me in with a generosity I've never forgotten." He smiled, and it was a good smile, warm and easy, and yet Miss Marple, who had spent a long life watching the small muscles around the eyes that a mouth cannot always govern, thought she detected something beneath it, not falseness, precisely, but effort, the particular effort of a man long practiced in the art of appearing entirely at ease. 30 years, she repeated pleasantly. Then you must have known her sister too. Alice, I believe her name was. The pause that followed was so brief that a less patient observer might have missed it entirely. No more than the space of a single indrawn breath, a stillness in the hand that had been, until that moment, idly turning a fountain pen upon the blotter. But Miss Marple had spent that lifetime learning to hear such silences the way other people hear a struck bell, and she heard this one quite clearly. "I knew of her," Victor Hale said, and his voice, when it came, was perfectly even, perfectly pleasant, and utterly without the small natural warmth that had softened his earlier words about Eleanor. "She had left the village, I believe, before I settled here properly. A sad business for the family, I understand, though it was rather before my time to know the particulars." "How curious," Miss Marple said mildly, "for I understood from Mr. Fenn at the post office that you arrived in Little Hadfield the very same summer Alice was said to have gone. One would think your paths might have crossed, even briefly." "The village is not so small that every soul crosses every other," Victor said, and smiled again. And this time Miss Marple noted that the smile did not reach so far as it had before, that something behind his eyes had gone very still and very careful, like a man walking a familiar path in the dark, testing each step before he commits his full weight to it. "I'm afraid I cannot help you there, Miss Marple. It was all quite before my proper acquaintance with the family." He turned the conversation, with the smooth competence of long practice, to the matter of Eleanor's modest will. The tea-room left to her assistant, Mabel Thorne. A small legacy to the church roof fund. Nothing remarkable, nothing that gave any obvious motive to violence. And Miss Marple allowed herself to be led along this new and blameless path, asking her questions, offering her sympathies, and all the while turning over, quietly, the small discordant note she had struck. It was as they rose to leave, and Victor Hale came around his desk to see them properly to the door with that same old-fashioned courtesy, that Miss Marple's eye fell, quite by accident, upon a small oil painting hung in the shadowed corner behind his desk. A portrait, unsigned, of a young man she took at first to be some Hale relation of an earlier generation, dressed in the fashion of some 30 years past. She paused before it, admiring it with genuine, unhurried interest, and asked, as one might ask of any pleasant ornament, who the subject might be. "My father," Victor said, a little too quickly, and then, recovering himself, added with a small laugh, "Though I confess, the family resemblance is rather more flattering to him than to me." Miss Marple said nothing to this, only smiled her mild grandmotherly smile, and allowed herself to be shown to the door. But she had noted, in that single unguarded moment, that the young man in the portrait wore, upon his little finger, a signet ring quite distinctly engraved with initials that were not, she was nearly certain, the initials of any Hale she had yet encountered in the parish register Reverend Whitfield had shown her that morning. They were nearly to the end of the High Street, walking in the thin grey light of early afternoon, when Diana, who had held her tongue with visible effort throughout the whole interview, burst out at last with the question that had plainly been troubling her since the solicitor's office. "Aunt Jane, you don't think? Surely a man so respected, so liked—" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, though her eyes remained fixed upon some middle distance only she seemed to occupy, "I have observed, over a very long life, that the men most liked in a village are very often the men who have worked hardest to be liked. And one does not labor so hard at a thing unless one has some very particular reason to need it." She was quiet a moment, her steps slow and thoughtful upon the cobbles. Mr. Hale arrived in Little Hadfield The same summer, Alice Pruitt vanished. He grew still and careful at the mere mention of her name, in a manner quite unlike a man recalling some distant, forgotten acquaintance. And unless I am very much mistaken in an old woman's eye for such things, Diana, the ring upon that portrait's finger bore initials that were not Hale at all. She stopped walking altogether and turned to look back, once, at the handsome grey front of the solicitor's office, its brass plate gleaming with such careful, unwavering respectability in the pale afternoon light. "I begin to wonder," she said softly, "whether Mr. Victor Hale did not arrive in this village quite so newly made as he would have us believe, and whether the name he wears so comfortably now was always entirely his own." Chapter 6. The Photograph in the Drawer. Eleanor Pruitt's rooms above the tea-room had been left, by mutual and unspoken agreement, very much as she had kept them, the bed made with the tight, careful corners of a woman who had never quite lost the habits of an earlier, more disciplined generation, the small fire grate swept clean, a single chair drawn close to the window where she had evidently liked to sit of an evening, looking down upon the quiet high street below. It was here that Miss Marple, with Diana and the permission of Eleanor's niece, a pleasant, rather overwhelmed young woman named Susan, come up from Bristol to see to her aunt's affairs, spent the better part of a grey Wednesday morning sorting through the modest accumulation of a modest life. There is a particular sorrow Miss Marple had always felt in the sorting of a dead woman's drawers, not the sorrow of the funeral, which is public and permitted and therefore, in its way, bearable, but the smaller, more private grief of discovering how very little remains of a person once the daily business of living has stopped. A hairbrush, a box of pressed handkerchiefs, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages, marking passages perhaps once found comforting, perhaps merely convenient. She handled each small object with the particular tenderness such work demands, and it was in the bottom drawer of an old walnut dresser, beneath a folded shawl that had plainly not been worn in some years, that her fingers found the photograph. It was old, its edges softened and browned with handling, the sort of photograph that has been taken out and looked at so many times over so many years that the very oils of the hand have worn its surface smooth. Two figures stood before it. A young woman, laughing, her head tilted back in the unguarded delight of someone who has just been told something wonderful. Her dark hair loosened by wind or carelessness, entirely, unmistakably alive in a way photographs of the long dead so rarely manage to preserve. Beside her stood a man, his arm about her waist with the easy familiarity of an established intimacy rather than a stolen moment. And where his face should have been, someone had taken a pin or the point of a knife and scored it away entirely, leaving only a small ragged wound of pale card where his features had once looked out at whoever held the camera. "Alice," Miss Marple said softly, and Susan, looking over her shoulder, nodded. "I think it must be. I never met her, of course. She'd gone before I was born, but Aunt Eleanor kept a smaller photograph of her downstairs, on the mantel, and the face is the same." Susan touched the scored-out figure beside her with a small frown. How odd that she should keep a photograph and yet destroy half of it. If she hated him so, why keep it at all? It was a fair question, and one Miss Marple turned over carefully as she continued through the drawer, for beneath the photograph lay a small bundle of correspondence bound with faded string, mostly household accounts, receipts from Dr. Coombs' surgery for what appeared to be a series of consultations stretching back some months, and, tucked among them, a single sheet in Eleanor's own careful hand, evidently a draft never sent, for it was crossed through in several places, and bore no address. "Dear Reverend Whitfield," it began, "I have thought long upon our conversation, and I find I cannot in conscience wait longer. I am not a well woman, as you know, and I find that a person facing her own ending thinks rather differently upon the endings she has arranged for others. Alice deserves her name. She deserved it 30 years ago, and I was too great a coward and too great a fool for love of a man I ought never to have." The sentence broke off there, crossed through with 3 heavy strokes of the pen, as though Eleanor had caught herself saying more than she intended, even to a private page never meant to be sent. Miss Marple read it twice, and felt the small pieces of 30 years' silence begin, at last, to arrange themselves into a shape she had long suspected, but not yet dared to name outright. Miss Marple, Susan's voice, when it came, held a note of genuine distress. "You don't think these letters from Dr. Combe, surely you can't imagine the doctor had anything to do with—" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, setting the draft letter aside with care, "that we ought not leap to imagine guilt merely because a person has kept something private. Dr. Combe attended your aunt rather often these past months, by the look of these accounts, and a woman facing what your aunt plainly believed to be her own ending would have very good and very innocent reason to consult her physician with some frequency." She folded her hands. "I think it far more likely that whatever Dr. Combe knew of your aunt's health, he knew it in the ordinary way of a conscientious doctor, and that her urgency, her sudden wish to give her sister back a name after 30 years of silence, sprang not from any conspiracy with him, but from the perfectly natural terror of a woman who understands, at last, that she has not unlimited time left in which to set right what she has long left wrong." She returned to the photograph, turning it gently in the grey light from the window, examining once more the small ragged wound where a man's face had once looked out. "This was not destroyed in anger, I think," she said slowly, half to herself. "Anger tears a photograph in half, or burns it entirely. This was scored away with patience, carefully, precisely, as though the one who did it wished the woman to remain whole and laughing, while the man beside her simply ceased to exist. That is not the act of a woman who hated her sister's lover, Diana. That is the act of a woman protecting someone from being recognized, even in a photograph kept in the privacy of her own drawer, 30 years after the fact." She looked up, and her expression had gone very still, very grave. "Eleanor did not destroy this photograph to punish the man in it. She destroyed his face to hide him from anyone who might one day open this drawer and know him by sight. Which tells us, I think, that she believed, right up until the last week of her life, that he was a man someone in this village might still recognize." She set the photograph down at last upon the dresser, beside the unsent letter to Reverend Whitfield, and looked out through the small window toward the high street below, where, at that very moment, the tall, well-dressed figure of Mr. Victor Hale could be seen passing along the pavement with his customary, unhurried grace, pausing to tip his hat to Mrs. Latimer with the easy, practiced warmth of a man entirely at peace with the world he had built. "I begin to think, my dears," Miss Marple said quietly, watching him pass, "that Eleanor Pruitt spent 30 years guarding not only her sister's memory, but a face she was terrified someone someday might still put a name to. And I wonder very much whether that fear, not old grief, but fresh fear, is precisely what brought her, at last, to her own stockroom door on a Sunday morning she had sworn, for 30 years, never again to open. Chapter 7. Village Whispers. By Thursday, the small store of patience Inspector Corbett had brought with him to Little Hadfeld had worn perceptibly thin. He received Miss Marple in the makeshift office the village had granted him at the back of the police house, a room smelling of paraffin and old case files, with the particular weariness of a man who has spent 3 days accumulating suspects and no certainties, and who suspects, moreover, that the elderly lady seated so placidly across from him with her knitting has already arrived somewhere he has not. "Dr. Combe," he said, consulting his notes with the air of a man reading out a list of disappointments, was seen leaving Miss Pruitt's rooms on no fewer than 4 occasions these past 2 months, at hours rather later than one generally associates with a physician's ordinary calls. When pressed, he grows evasive, won't say what passed between them. A man doesn't grow evasive over nothing, Miss Marple. He does, however, grow evasive over a great many things that are not murder, Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles clicking on in their steady rhythm. "I wonder, Inspector, whether you have considered that a doctor's discretion regarding a patient's health is not so very different from a solicitor's discretion regarding a client's will, a habit of silence kept out of duty, rather than guilt." Corbett's look suggested he had considered no such thing and would be glad of guidance, though pride forbade him from saying so outright. It was, in the end, Diana, grown rather bolder in the pursuit of village intelligence than her aunt had perhaps anticipated when the summer began, who brought the matter to its natural and rather touching conclusion. She had called that same afternoon upon Mabel Thorne, the tea-room's young assistant, ostensibly to offer condolences and inquire what would become of the shop, and had found the girl in a state of such visible distress that Diana's kind heart had prompted a gentler line of questioning than the inspector's men had thought to try. "She wept the whole time I was there," Diana reported that evening, over a supper neither of them had much appetite for. Not for herself, Aunt Jane, for Miss Pruitt. She said Eleanor had known this past fortnight about her engagement to young Tom Pargeter and had sworn to keep it secret until Mabel found the courage to tell her own mother, who disapproves of the match rather violently on account of the Pargeters' politics of all things. Mabel thought, and I confess I thought so too, dreadful of me, that perhaps she'd inherit the shop, and no one would think twice, but she says she'd give the whole of it back twice over to have Eleanor still living. She's quite broken by it. Miss Marple received this with a small, satisfied nod, for it confirmed precisely what her own observation of the girl, red-eyed, restless-handed, unable to meet an interviewer's gaze not from guilt, but from the particular exhaustion of grief compounded by secret-keeping, had already suggested to her. "A secret engagement is a very ordinary thing to hide, my dear, and explains a young woman's furtiveness a great deal more comfortably than murder does." Dr. Combs' evasions resolved themselves with rather less charm but equal finality the following morning, when the physician, cornered at last by Corbett, with rather more directness than tact, admitted, with the particular relief of a professional man glad to set down a burden of discretion he had carried unwillingly, that Eleanor Pruitt had come to him some months previous with a heart grown dangerously weak, a condition she had sworn him to silence upon, wishing no one, not even her niece, to know how little time she likely had remaining. "She asked me only one thing beyond the ordinary business of her treatment," he told Corbett, with a doctor's careful precision. She asked me how much time a person in her condition might reasonably expect. She wished, she said, to set certain matters right before it was too late to do so properly. It was this last detail, reported to Miss Marple that evening, with Corbett's grudging respect now audible beneath his exasperation, that settled something in her mind entirely. "There, Inspector," she said, setting down her knitting with the air of a woman who has at last been handed the final piece of a pattern she has been assembling for some days. "You have your answer as to why Eleanor moved, after 30 years of silence, to disturb an old grave. She was dying, and knew it. And a woman facing her own ending finds she can no longer bear to leave another person's ending unmarked and unmourned. It is not so very strange a thing when one considers it properly. It is, I think, one of the most natural impulses a dying woman might have." Corbett rubbed a hand across his tired face. "Then I've cleared 2 suspects and gained not a single fresh one, Miss Marple, and I begin to wonder whether this case will simply have to join the ranks of the unsolved. A locked door, no wound upon the body, a doctor's verdict of natural causes that satisfies no one's instincts, myself included, and not one soul in this village with a proper motive to have wished her harm." "I would not despair quite yet, Inspector," Miss Marple said, and there was something in her voice, quiet, but entirely without doubt, that made Corbett look up sharply from his notes. "You have cleared 2 suspects because their secrets, once uncovered, proved to be secrets of love and illness. The ordinary, forgivable furtiveness of people protecting the small privacies of their own lives. But there is a third kind of secrecy, Inspector, that I have not yet seen properly examined in this case, and it is the kind that does not spring from love or illness at all, but from a much older and much colder wish to remain unknown." She rose, gathering her shawl about her shoulders with the unhurried composure that had, by now, become entirely familiar to Corbett, though it no longer struck him as belonging to a woman without purpose. "I wonder, Inspector, whether I might trouble the good Reverend Whitfield for a look at his old hymn books. Not the ones presently in use in the pews, you understand. The older ones, kept in the vestry cupboard, that a family might once have owned privately and later given to the church." She paused at the door, and there was, for just a moment, something almost sorrowful in her expression, as though she already glimpsed, however dimly, the shape of the thing she was walking toward. "I have a notion, you see, that Alice Pruitt left behind a good deal more than an unused train ticket and a scored-out photograph, and that somewhere in this village, tucked away in a place no one has thought to disturb in 30 years, there is a page of paper that will tell us, at last, precisely whose face it was that Eleanor Pruitt spent 3 decades so carefully, so lovingly, so fatally protecting." Chapter 8. The Cufflink. The vestry cupboard, when Reverend Whitfield unlocked it for her with a key that plainly saw little use, released upon opening a smell of dust and old paper, and the particular mustiness of things kept too long in a room that was never quite warm enough. A smell, Miss Marple thought, not unlike the smell of the stockroom itself, as though all the forgotten corners of Little Hadfeld had, over 30 years, come to share some common quality of held breath. "These were given to the church some years back," the Reverend said, lifting down a stack of hymn books bound in worn calfskin, their gilt lettering long since faded to a ghost of itself. Family Bibles and hymnals, mostly, from households that had died out or moved away. I confess I've never had occasion to go through them properly. One doesn't like to disturb what's been given in good faith. No, Miss Marple agreed gently, drawing a chair to the small vestry table and settling herself before the stack with the patient thoroughness of a woman prepared to spend the whole of the afternoon at so quiet a task. Though I think, Reverend, that some things are given not so much in good faith as in the simple wish to be rid of them, and it is precisely those things, I find, that most reward a little disturbing. She worked through the books with care, turning each brittle page with the reverence one gives to something both fragile and possibly dangerous, and it was perhaps the 4th volume down, a small plain hymnal, its flyleaf inscribed in a round girlish hand, Alice Margaret Pruitt, Confirmation, with love. That yielded, when she opened it, a small folded square of paper tucked between the pages devoted to evensong, and, falling with it, a single object that struck the vestry table with a soft, metallic sound entirely out of keeping with the room's dusty hush. It was a cufflink, silver, tarnished now to a dull grey, but finely made, the sort of small good object a young man of modest means might have saved for and worn with particular pride. Miss Marple lifted it into the grey light from the vestry window and turned it slowly between her fingers, and there, engraved upon its face in small, elegant script, she found 2 initials, V. H. For a long moment she said nothing at all, only sat with the small, cold weight of it in her palm, while Reverend Whitfield, watching her face, seemed to understand, before she had spoken a single word, that something of great and terrible significance had just passed between her fingers. V.H., she said at last, very quietly. There's no one of those initials in the parish now, the Reverend said, frowning. Save. And then he stopped, and Miss Marple watched the colour leave his face by careful degrees, the way frost creeps across a window pane. Save Mr. Victor Hale, she finished for him. But his name is Hale, the Reverend said, though his voice had grown uncertain. Has always been Hale, as long as I've known him. As long as you have known him, Miss Marple agreed. Which is to say, Reverend, precisely as long as he has lived in this village. Which is to say, precisely since the summer Alice Pruitt is said to have vanished. She set the cufflink down upon the small square of paper it had fallen with, and unfolded that paper with careful fingers, finding within it a few lines in the same round, girlish hand as the hymnal's flyleaf. The ink faded, but the sentiment, even after 30 years, entirely legible in its youthful, wounded fury. He says I must not speak his true name to anyone, not even to E. He says his whole future rests upon the Whitcomb marriage, and that I am a fool to think he would ever choose me over it. I gave him back his ring today. He wept, and said he loved me still, and I do not know, any longer, which of us he is deceiving. Miss Marple read it twice, and folded it away again with the particular gentleness one gives to a voice 30 years silenced, and sat for a moment entirely still, the pieces of the pattern she had been assembling for the better part of a week, arranging themselves, at last, into a shape too coherent to be doubted any longer. Victor Hale did not arrive in Little Hadfeld a stranger, Reverend, she said quietly. I think he arrived a young man already entangled with Alice Pruitt, perhaps under some other name, some earlier version of himself he has since taken great pains to bury, and I think he abandoned her, or attempted to, in favour of a marriage that would secure him precisely the respectability he has spent 30 years so carefully wearing. The Whitcomb family, I recall from the parish records, were a family of some considerable standing in the county before their line died out. A young solicitor, marrying into such a family, would have found his whole future assured by it. Assured, that is, so long as no inconvenient entanglement from his past rose up to unmake it. "You cannot mean," the Reverend said, very low, "that Eleanor knew this all these years?" "I think Eleanor knew everything," Miss Marple said, and there was in her voice something very close to sorrow. "I think she walked in upon a quarrel in that stockroom 30 years ago. A quarrel between her sister and a young man determined to protect a future he had built upon abandoning her, and that whatever passed in that room ended in Alice's death, whether by intention or by the sudden violence of a man cornered by his own cowardice, I cannot yet say. And I think Eleanor, faced with a truth that would destroy not only her sister's memory, but very possibly her sister's murderer, chose silence, chose to bury her sister quietly, and closed her shop every Sunday after, as a private penance for a truth she could not bear to speak aloud, and, in doing so, without ever quite intending it, she protected the very man who had killed the person she loved best in all the world." She looked down at the small tarnished cufflink lying upon the vestry table, its engraved initials catching, faintly, the grey afternoon light. "I have sat across a tea-table from that man, Reverend, and taken his sympathy, and admired his fine manners, and thought him, as this whole village thinks him, a picture of respectability." She rose slowly, gathering the folded letter and the small cufflink together with hands that did not tremble, though her voice, when it came again, had grown very quiet indeed. "I begin to understand, now, precisely why Eleanor Pruitt went to that stockroom on a Sunday morning after 30 years of never once setting foot in it on the Lord's Day. She had decided, at the very end of her life, to give her sister back her true name, and I think she must have told him so, and I think, Reverend Whitfield, that the killer in this case has been sitting across our tea tables, offering us his condolences, and shaking our hands with every appearance of grief, from the very first hour we arrived in Little Hadfeld. Chapter 9. What the ledger page never said. Reverend Whitfield did not sleep that night, or so his face told Miss Marple plainly enough when she called upon him again the following morning, finding him not at his usual desk among the christening ledgers, but seated alone in the cold, empty nave, his hands folded before him in an attitude less of prayer than of a man bracing himself for something long postponed. "You knew," Miss Marple said, seating herself beside him in the pew without waiting to be asked, for she had come to understand, over the course of that long week, that some confessions require the comfort of not being looked at directly while they are given. "Not merely suspected, Reverend. You knew." He was silent a long while, his eyes fixed upon the plain cross above the altar, and when at last he spoke, his voice had the flat, exhausted quality of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he had half forgotten what it was to stand without it. "Eleanor came to me that Sunday night, 30 years ago," he said. "Not to confess a murder, Miss Marple. I want you to understand that, whatever else you come to think of me. She came to me broken past speaking, and it was a long while before I had the whole of it from her, and even then only in pieces, the way a person gives up a truth too large to say all at once." He drew a slow breath. Alice was dead. There had been a quarrel over the marriage, over his abandonment of her, over some promise he had made and broken, and in the heat of it he had struck her, or pushed her. Eleanor was never entirely certain which, only that Alice had fallen against the stockroom shelving and had not risen again. He fled. Eleanor found her sister already gone by the time she came to see what the commotion was. And she came to you, Miss Marple said quietly, not the police. She came to me broken by grief, and by something worse than grief, by the terrible arithmetic of love, Miss Marple, which asks a person to weigh one loss against another and choose the lesser. He turned to look at her at last, and his eyes were wet and old, and entirely without defence. She said to me, "If I tell the truth, Reverend, I lose Alice twice over, once to death and once to scandal, for the whole village will speak of nothing but a wild girl and her married lover for the rest of their days, and no one will remember she was gentle and funny, and loved the wildflowers along the Ashton Road better than any hothouse rose. Let me bury her quietly, and let her memory be spared what her life could not be. And God forgive me, Miss Marple, I was young in my calling then, and grief struck myself at the sight of her, and I believed, I truly believed, that I was helping her toward mercy, rather than helping her toward a lie that would outlive us both." "And so you helped her bury her sister," Miss Marple said, "in the unmarked grave by the yew." "That night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "the two of us alone, in the dark, with no more ceremony than a few words I could barely speak for weeping. I told myself it was an act of love. I have told myself that every day for 30 years, Miss Marple, and I find this week that I can no longer make myself believe it." Miss Marple sat with this a long moment, her hands folded upon her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice held no accusation, only the particular gentleness she reserved for those who had erred out of love rather than malice, though she did not pretend the error had been small. "And Victor Hale," she said, "did Eleanor ever tell you his part in it?" "Not by name. Not then, only that a man had done this, a man of some standing, whom she would not name even to me, and that she had made her peace, in her own way, with never speaking his name aloud, so long as he never again came near what remained of her sister." He shook his head slowly. "I did not know it was Hale until this past fortnight, Miss Marple, when Eleanor came to me a second time, not broken now, but resolved, in a way I had not seen in her in 30 years. She told me she was dying. She told me she could not go to her own grave, leaving Alice in an unmarked one, whatever the cost to herself or to anyone else. She asked me what must be done to give her sister a true stone, a true name, a true date." His hands tightened upon each other. I asked her, gently, whether she understood what such an inquiry might disturb after so long. And she said to me, "I remember it precisely, Miss Marple, for it has not left me since." She said, "I have protected the wrong person for 30 years, Reverend, out of a love that curdled somewhere along the way into cowardice. I find, now that I am dying, that I would rather leave this world honest than safe." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was something in her face. Grief, certainly, but also a kind of clear-eyed recognition, as though the whole terrible shape of the thing had finally settled into place before her. "She told him," Miss Marple said softly, "before she came to you the second time, or very shortly after, she told Victor Hale what she intended to do." "I believe she must have," the Reverend said. "She said as much to me, in a manner, that she owed him the courtesy of warning before she set the matter in motion, so that he might have time to make his own peace with it, or to leave the district quietly, if that was his wish." She was, even then, even at the very end, still trying to spare him the worst of it. She could not seem to help herself. And he, Miss Marple said, very quietly, could not afford to be spared gently. A true stone, a true name, a true date would lead in very short order to the question of how Alice Pruitt came to die on that particular Sunday 30 years ago. And from there, Reverend, to the ledger page torn from her stockroom accounts, recording, I do not doubt, some note of the quarrel or the visitor that day, kept perhaps as Eleanor's own quiet insurance across all these years, though she never had the courage to use it. She rose slowly from the pew, smoothing her coat with hands that were, for the first time in that long interview, not entirely steady. Eleanor Pruitt spent 30 years protecting a murderer out of grief-stricken love, Reverend Whitfield, and in the final weeks of her life she found, at last, the courage to stop. And it was that courage, not any old sin, that killed her. He could forgive her 30 years of silence. He could not forgive her 1 week of honesty. She looked toward the altar, and the cold morning light falling through the eastern window, and her voice, when it came again, had gone very soft, very sorrowful. I think, Reverend, that it is time we told Inspector Corbett the whole of it. The grave, the cufflink, the letter, and the ledger page that I believe, if we look carefully enough, was never destroyed at all, but hidden by Eleanor in the one place she trusted would never be searched, among the pages of her sister's own hymn book, where only a very patient old woman, looking for exactly the right kind of secret, might ever think to find it. Chapter 10. The Door That Finally Opens. They found the missing ledger page precisely where Miss Marple had said they would, folded small and kept flat between the pages of Alice's confirmation hymnal, tucked just beside the cufflink's hiding place, as though Eleanor had wanted the two things kept always together, evidence and relic, guilt and grief, side by side in the one book she trusted no one would think to open. The entry, in Eleanor's own careful, sloping hand, was brief and dated the Sunday of Alice's death, and read only, V.H. called at the shop this morning, against my wishes. A. Much distressed after. 6 words too few to hang a man, and 30 years too late to save one. And yet, laid beside the letter, the photograph, the unused ticket, and the small tarnished cufflink with its telling initials, it was enough, Inspector Corbett said grimly, to justify what came next. They went to him in the late afternoon, when the light along the high street had gone the soft amber of an ordinary autumn day, entirely unremarkable, entirely undeserving of what it was about to witness. Victor Hale received them in his office with the same easy courtesy he had shown Miss Marple on her first visit, rising from behind his desk, offering chairs, inquiring after their health, and it was, Miss Marple thought afterward, the very completeness of that performance, sustained even in the moment of Corbett laying the cufflink upon the blotter before him, that told her more plainly than any confession could have done just how long, and how thoroughly, this man had trained himself to survive by seeming. He looked at the cufflink for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he sat back down. I wondered, he said, when someone would finally think to look. You might have told us yourself, Mr. Hale, Corbett said, not unkindly, and spared an old woman the trouble of finding it for you. I might have done a great many things 30 years ago, Victor Hale said, and something in his voice had changed entirely now, the warm, careful cadence of the respectable solicitor fallen away like a coat, shrugged from tired shoulders, leaving beneath it something older and wearier and very nearly relieved. I was 21 when I came to this village under my mother's family name, having left behind a father whose debts and disgraces I wished never to be traced to me again. I met Alice within a month of arriving, and I loved her. I want that understood, whatever else is believed of me. I loved her more honestly than I have loved anything since. And then the Whitcomb girls' family took an interest in me, and I saw, laid out before me, an entire respectable future I had never dared imagine for myself, and I chose it. I chose it, and told myself Alice would recover and marry some good farmer and forget me in time. He looked, for a moment, toward the window, toward the ordinary golden light falling across the ordinary street. She did not forget me. She came to the shop that Sunday to tell me she meant to write to my betrothed and tell her everything, not out of malice, she said, only because she could not bear to watch me build a lie and call it a life. We quarreled. I do not remember, even now, entirely how it happened, only that I pushed her, in anger, meaning nothing more than to make her stop speaking, and she fell, and did not rise, and I have spent 30 years since telling myself it was an accident, which is, I have come to understand only this past week, simply another lie I built to live inside. And Eleanor, Miss Marple said gently, found you there. She found me kneeling over her sister's body, weeping, entirely undone, he said, and she did not scream, or call the constable, or curse me, as I believe I half wished she would. She only looked at me a long moment, and said, "Go, I will see to this, but you will never come near what remains of her again, and you will spend the rest of your life being worthy of the silence I am about to give you." His voice, on this last, broke very slightly, the first true crack Miss Marple had yet seen in 30 years of careful masonry. "I have tried, Miss Marple. God help me, in my own twisted way, I have tried. I have been a good solicitor, a generous neighbor, a faithful husband to a wife I came, in time, to love genuinely, whatever the shameful manner of our meeting. I told myself, across all these years, that I had earned my peace, that the debt was paid in decency, if not in truth. And when Eleanor came to tell you she meant to give Alice back her name," Miss Marple said quietly, "you understood that no amount of decency would survive the truth being spoken aloud." He closed his eyes. "She came to my office, much as you did, Miss Marple, and sat in that very chair, and told me she was dying, and that she found she could no longer carry the lie into her own grave without first setting Alice's straight. She said she owed me the courtesy of warning me, so that I might arrange my affairs, or leave quietly, before the truth came out." His hands, folded upon the desk, trembled now, faintly. She was so gentle about it, even then. Even at the very end, she was thinking of my dignity, my chance to leave with some shred of grace intact. And I understood, sitting in that chair, listening to 30 years of her extraordinary, undeserved mercy, that I could not survive being spoken of honestly. I had built an entire man out of her silence, Miss Marple, and I found I would rather commit one more sin than watch him be unmade. "You went to her on the Sunday," Corbett said, low. "I went to beg her to wait. Only to wait. A month, a season, until I might arrange to leave the country quietly, take my wife somewhere new, begin again under some further alteration of myself, as I had done once before." He shook his head slowly. She would not wait. She said Alice had waited 30 years already, and a coward's convenience was not reason enough to make her wait a day longer. And in that stockroom, Miss Marple, in that same stockroom, 30 years almost to the very door, something in me that I had kept caged all that time simply broke loose again. I do not ask anyone to forgive what I did. I do not, any longer, entirely forgive it myself. I held her, and I did not mean, I think, to kill her, only to silence her a moment, only to buy myself the time I no longer had. And when I understood what I had done, I bolted the door from the inside, as I had oiled it to do some weeks before, in a fit of planning I am ashamed now even to recall. And I climbed out through the small window at the rear, which sticks only if one does not know its particular trick, and I told myself, walking home in the dark, that this too would become a thing I survived, the way I had survived all the rest. The silence that followed this was long and complete and entirely without triumph on anyone's part. Miss Marple, watching his face across the desk, a face gone, at last entirely unguarded, entirely without performance, an old and tired face beneath the handsome, careful one the village had known for 30 years, felt not the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but something far closer to sorrow. You bolted a door on a woman who had given you 30 years of undeserved silence, she said quietly, because she had finally chosen, at the very end of her life, to stop lying for you. I wonder, Mr. Hale, whether you understand that it was not truth that killed Eleanor Pruitt. It was the particular cruelty of a man who had built his entire self upon someone else's mercy, and could not bear, even at the last, to let that mercy end on its own terms rather than his. He did not answer this. He did not, Miss Marple thought, have any answer left in him that would not simply be one more small performance, and to his very limited credit, he seemed, in that moment, to know it, and to be, in some strange and terrible way, glad to be done with the effort of pretending otherwise. Corbett rose and spoke the necessary words, and Victor Hale went with him quietly, without struggle, without further protest. A man walking, Miss Marple thought, watching from the window as they crossed the golden street toward the police house, not toward disgrace so much as toward the simple relief of no longer having to hold his face in its accustomed shape. Alice Pruitt was given, at last, a true stone. It stood by the following spring beneath the old yew, her name cut deep and clean into new grey granite, her true date set down at last, after 30 years of silence, and the whole village turned out for the small, quiet service Reverend Whitfield conducted over her. A service, Miss Marple noted, in which the old clergyman's voice broke more than once, and no one thought the less of him for it, for by then the whole sorrowful history had made its way, gently and without much malice, through every cottage in Little Hadfeld, and grief, once properly named, had softened rather than sharpened the village's judgment of everyone involved. The copper kettle did not reopen at once. It stood shuttered through the autumn and the winter, its copper kettle sign creaking gently on unoiled hinges, while Mabel Thorne married her Tom Pargeter in the spring and considered, with her new husband's encouragement, whether she had the heart to take the shop on after all. In the end she did, and on the first Sunday of the following summer, for the first time in 31 years, the tea-room's doors stood open on the Lord's Day, its windows fogged once more with the friendly breath of teapots, a small hand-lettered card in the window reading simply, "In memory of Alice and Eleanor Pruitt, two sisters who loved each other imperfectly, as we all must." Miss Marple, back once more in London by then, thought of it often, the small stone by the yew, the reopened door, the particular ordinary courage it had taken Eleanor Pruitt, at the very end of a life spent protecting a lie, to choose truth instead, and to pay for that choice with the last of her days. She thought, too, of Victor Hale, awaiting his trial in a cell some counties distant, a man who had spent 30 years constructing, with genuine effort and genuine, if compromised, devotion, a decent life atop an act he had never quite found the courage to confess. And she found she could not entirely hate him, though she did not, for a moment, excuse him either. He was, she thought, simply what happens when a person mistakes the performance of goodness for goodness itself, and forgets, across enough patient years, that the difference matters. "It is a strange thing, Diana," she said, over their last tea together, before the London train, the autumn light falling soft and gold across the cups between them, "how very much silence can look like love, when it is worn long enough and worn well enough." Eleanor's silence was love, at the beginning, a sister's fierce, grieving wish to spare the dead further wounding. But love, kept too long past its season, curdles into something else entirely, and calls itself loyalty, and calls itself mercy, right up until the moment it becomes merely complicity, indistinguishable, at the last, from the very guilt it once meant to spare. She set down her cup, and looked, for a moment, entirely far away. "We forgive the dead so easily, my dear. It is the living we can never quite let go of what they have done. Nor, I think, should we. Truth is a hard mercy, but it is the only mercy in the end that does not eventually turn against the very people it was meant to protect."